All right, as you might guess from what I have right here, the focus of this going modular segment is on the ever important, ever present, and sometimes frustrating patch cables. So this particular focus will talk about what are some of the issues with patch cables that you might have, what are the key considerations when you buy cables, and what are some strategies for organization. And like everything else in this series, I would say to you that a lot of this is subjective and it's based on your own preferences. You know, there's a certain ergonomics of any workspace, whether it's your office workspace, your workbench if you're building something, or certainly your modular setup. I mean, the very ways in which you create your modules, the way you decide on a case and where you put your modules, that's very personal. That's subjective based on your workflow. And then the use of the cables itself, I think, is also very similar. I guess to start off, we can talk about what some of the considerations are with cables. I think an initial one would be the issue of the width of your cables. I guess not the connector itself, so this is an 1/8 inch. Obviously, Eurorack cables are mono, and you're typically patching one point to another point. In some cases, you're actually, we'll talk about the tip top with the stackable cables, of course. That's not always the case, but for the most part, you're taking a cable and you're taking one jack and plugging it into another to either transform or carry an audio signal or a CV or a gate signal. So I think most people know that working with modular Eurorack setups. So the width can be an issue here. So in other words, when you're selecting cables, you might think about whether or not, like in this scenario here, I believe these are black market. I bought a bunch of these, and my idea was I wanted a number of small cables, particularly so I could go from my envelope generator right into my mixer module. So I wanted something really small, and in some ways, if this could even be smaller, that might be ideal. And maybe later on the unit, I'll show you this. So, you know, in this case, I wasn't buying it because of the head of the cable, and I didn't think about that. These seem pretty good overall, and I have quite a few that are similar, and you can see they're not super wide there. This particular one, I think this I got when I bought a tip-top audio case, and it came as a free cable. I probably wouldn't normally purchase this one because my feeling would be that this is a little bit too wide. So obviously what happens is if you start to patch cables in over time, you know, it becomes kind of a spaghetti mess, and you have issues with accessing your jacks or accessing some of the control knobs or faders on your Eurorack modules. So, you know, the width is certainly a consideration there. I mentioned, I'll put a few of these back here. I mentioned the other consideration, of course, is length. So as I said, you'll probably find that certain modules, and all this really will depend on the setup of your cases. If you look at Colin Benders or folks like that that have ginormous Eurorack setups, there are different considerations because they have more modules to patch, and they also have, in some cases, really great lengths to move between in terms of trying to connect something that it might be in one case, and then you might have another case stacked way up on top. So, you know, for that reason, you'll probably end up buying different length of cables. These are often described on Amazon or other sites, music sites like Perfect Circuit, as either centimeter or inches. So, you know, you just have to kind of figure that out when you order the cables. Again, I got a slew of small ones here because I have a lot of patch points that are pretty close to one another. If I'm moving from one end of the case to another, these aren't going to do the trick, and so I could move up to the next size here. And you can see this is a little bit longer, so it gives me a little more to work with. And then I'll talk about the cable organization with these Pomona cable holders, but this is then a little longer than my last one. So my ideal, I guess, is if you have maybe 10 of each size. Again, this is going to depend on your setup. Obviously at 10 you might have 100 of these, but it'll depend on the size of your setup. But if you have a very large case, if you had a small one like 60 HP or something like that, and that was it, you're just using a few modules at a time and switching them out for live gigs, then obviously you could get by just fine with some small cables like these, and then maybe these little longer ones, and perhaps some of these. So these get a little longer. So far I'd say I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think 7 different sizes here. So moving up, you have these. These are a little bit longer than my last ones. So again, the theme here is just to try to give me more ability to patch points that are greater distances as I'm moving around the Eurorack module and modules. And of course, with your cases, one of the keys is, because every time you're maybe doing something different, you'll probably use different cables in your setup with different scenarios. And again, it really does depend on your system and what's patched to what. That changes every time, I would say, when I'm creating a sound or creating some kind of sequence. So 2 more here to look at. These are, I believe these are like the 36-inch, so 3 feet long. And then I just recently picked up, Perfect Circuit had a sale, so these are the 4 foot. So they're a little bit longer than, obviously, a little bit longer, 1 foot longer than the 3 foot. That's kind of makes perfect sense, doesn't it? So yeah, and I ended up getting like 10 of these 4 foot cables, thinking that should keep me going if I'm trying to go from extreme distances on my cases. And a little bit later I will show you the cases so you can get a sense of maybe what I'm talking about with the lengths and so forth. So the first consideration again for cables would be the width, the head of the plug that goes into your jack, as far as is that going to create ergonomic issues. The second would be the length of the cables. The third you can see here, and I have to say, like, in my mind, I'm not very good at, I have different colored cables. The third consideration I was going to say is the color of your cable. So certainly you could say, you might get like different lengths of these small cables. And I've done a little bit of this, so I might take the purple ones and use only the purple, say, as a gate signal coming out of my envelope generator into my VCA. And then I could use orange ones, taking the audio out from the VCA into my mixer. And I have an erogenous tones setup that has 8 channels on each of the 3 modules. So again, I bought these for that purpose. The best laid plans, right? I mean, sometimes I say I'm going to do that. I'm going to try to be really organized, use this just for a CV or gate signal and use another color for an audio signal, but sometimes that doesn't happen. You could, if you had the same color, if you had a lot of greens of different lengths, you could maybe have one particular patch that is going from one module to the next, and you're trying to trace that throughout the cable mesh. If you had that color coordinated, that would allow you to actually then maybe have some organization. Another option, of course, would be, are they called glowworm, the cables that glow in the dark? And you can also have those, and in some cases you might be able to then see a signal if there isn't an LED on one of your modules and you can't see if something's being triggered, or you can't see when it's being triggered as far as the pulse of it, the rhythm of it. That also could be very useful. I don't have any of those, but some people enjoy those certainly. And then yet another consideration, and I don't know if this is really entirely related to the, I mean, it's, I guess you could say this is the, this gets into the issue of just getting a cable that allows you to make more than one patch point. So obviously with the tip-top cables, they're stackable. And so if I'm plugging something in, maybe I'm taking a clock signal and I want it to go to 2 parameters on my oscillator or something like that, I could do that. So obviously this allows me to take one signal and transform it into 2. And you don't have to use another tip-top cable for that, right? You could use a non-stackable coming out of there, and it gives you the same effect. So these are pretty handy. I have to say I haven't used them recently. I don't know why. Just sometimes when I patch, I don't. I'm not thinking in twos like that. What I more commonly use are these, and these I think are very useful in terms of your modular setup. So essentially, this will take a signal, a CD signal or an audio signal, and it will give you 5 of those, right? So there's one original and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 coming out. And I use this all the time, and essentially it allows you to, as I just said, take one signal and multiply that so that you can use it in different places. And this can be very useful if I'm creating a very quick patch. Sometimes I might take you know, a clock signal just to get something going to hear how it sounds, and I will take multiples of that and patch that into other modules. Could be for, you know, triggering an oscillator or other parameters, and it's kind of useful. And then if you use a bunch of these, obviously you could have different sets of multiple signals going to multiple modules and inputs and so forth. So these are like really handy, and I think they go hand in hand with your cable collection as far as having opportunities to transform what you're doing with your modular setup. And then I would say one additional cable that you may find handy, this depends on what you're doing. You know, a lot of times when you're coming from your output, your module, if you have something like a Rosie or some Unity mixer or something like that, you're often going to be taking a 1/8 inch to a 1/4 inch, right? So for my mixer, I'm typically taking the 1/8 inch into the 1/4 inch, and sometimes you may be adjusting the gain or the trim on your mixer for the signal coming out of your modules. But these are very handy. So you know, as I'll show you my one of my cases in a second, I have an 8-track mixer and a module. And so what I could do is take all 8 signals, sum those together, adjust them, and then take one cable, the 1/8 to 1/4, out to my mixer. But what I sometimes find is that if I'm recording something, I want to actually have the opportunity to have my individual channels in my post mix. So if I'm doing, you know, a crazy set of sounds, and I have those all tweaked in and they sound good, and I trust myself, I could send just the one channel. But what if I want to do some panning stuff? Because a lot of times you're working with mono signals. You might be doing something, certainly there are, you know, panning modules on your Euro rack, you can do panning. But I often will take a mono signal and then transform it into stereo, or split it to a more to the left channel and another sound from my modules into the right. If that's the case, then obviously I want a lot of these, because I can take up to, I mean, I could take more, but if I'm using my one mixer module, I can take 8 of these out, send them into my mixer, which is over 16 channels, and then when I'm doing my recording, I have the opportunity to fine-tune each of those tracks, as opposed to trying to get it right from the 8 channels going to 1. So I find that a lot of these are handy as well, and again, you can pick these up. They're not too expensive. These are Hosa, and they're different lengths, and sometimes I need these a little longer, so I have some that are about twice the length of the one I'm showing you here. So I think that's another consideration. You might use those. And then probably you'll have some 1/4 to 1/4 cables if you're coming out from something that is either going to go into your mixer in conjunction with your Euro rack, or I guess probably most modules. There's only one module, the Rosie I have, that I think has a 1/4 input or 1/4 output. Most of the times you're doing 1/8 inch, but obviously if you have a bunch of these and all your other cables that you use for your other electronic non-modular instruments, you can mix and match and use a series of these as needed. Okay, so I'm shifting the orientation now here on the camera, as you can see, to my Euro rack modules and my cases. If you're wondering, you're probably seeing some little things flying around. I should show you what these are. So I have this instrument of sorts that is a series of guitar strings, and I'm doing a piece with that. So if you're seeing that in the camera today, that is because I'm trying to work with that for a upcoming track, and I probably will do a another video here in the Going Modular series on integrating your non-Euro rack or external gear, whether effects or video synthesizers or pedals or other synthesizers out there that will allow you to merge with your sound setup in your Eurorack modular system. So I was referring to this particular setup. So again, if I'm coming from this end of my case here to this end of my case, I might be thinking about the size of cable. So this is like a 36-inch cable. More than enough room there, length rather. And this is I have two tip-top audio cases right here. So, this comes in handy if I'm taking envelope generator signal from my erogenous tones here, from radar, and maybe I want to go up here or something like this into one of my modules here, the Fusion VCR or something like that. If I'm using my Scion in conjunction with a plant or something like that, which I need to do a setup, but I have this new succulent that I'm going to use with this because this uses biofeedback pads and so forth, then I might be taking up to like 4 CV gate signals and sending it out to various sound generators, wherever those happen to be in one of these 3 cases. I probably will at one point also do a thing on case ergonomics, because that's the other side of this. I'm talking about cables today, but really it occurs to me that this is very specific to where my modules are. And of course, that's something that's very subjective, and I have to say very fun about a modular system is that you're constantly thinking about where's the best place to put things, because that is going to affect ultimately your patch points. That's going to affect the length of cables, and I mentioned the width and those kind of fun issues. So what I've done here is I use all my erogenous tone modules, because they all go together. They all have 8 channels. So going from the left, I've got the radar, and then I've got my VCA, and then I've got my mixer. And that's why I said I want to use these mini cables, the smallest ones, because I can essentially take, like right here, we can come right out of the VCA into the mixer right here, and that's, as you can see, a really small cable, so it's pretty handy. And hopefully if I do this right, and this is a bad example, I mean, look how like spaghetti bowl this is, but if I'm doing this right, essentially I can leave, this here is not going to come too far in this spot. I mean, you can kind of see here if I take a stick that there's room here, and anytime there's room here, it means I can get to these knobs, right? I can move them. I can actually have an effect on what I'm trying to do. In the cases of all around here, right, it's not so ergonomically sound because maybe I'm trying to control maths up here and I'm running into all these cables. I have to say that there's one main patch I'm working on for use with this instrument and a drone. It's going to be a 2-track composition. And so I was previously trying to set up a percussion setup, and that reminds me, I keep saying I know that I need to do another video on this, that, and the other. I will do a video on percussion as well. But so I actually have maybe 2 or 3 different patches going at the same time, and I was too lazy to actually tear this down because I also wanted to show you a little bit about just how messy it can get with the cables. So again, you see some of my multiples here. This is another version of that same one. It's more like a little a jack, I guess you could say. Again, as I mentioned, those are very handy for taking signals and multiplying them, splitting them, and so forth, and doing more with your setup. So I guess my suggestion on this is, since it is very subjective, and your cases are going to differ, your modules are going to differ, it really is, of course, up to you to figure out what best fits your system. Whenever you're going from one case to another, again, you're probably getting into this is quite obvious, you're getting into longer cables. I know that there is a module that Dopefer makes that allows you, it's a pretty affordable module, and it essentially is just one of those ribbon cables, and it is a series of jacks, and so you could basically have patch points in one case, and those are linked to the other case. And I think that would actually be useful if you had multiple cases, and particularly if they span long distances, because it's not that you can't find a long enough cable like this one, this 3-foot 36-inch cable here, to span one case to the next. But anytime you do that, guess what? You're adding to the spaghetti, right? You're adding to the mix here because you're creating a cable here, and none of us probably are going to take them and use cable ties or something like this in the midst of patching, because the whole point of a Eurorack setup is that you want to be able to remove cables and put them in and so forth. So I think it's again very personal how you decide to set your system up, but opportunities are out there, I think, to think about organization, and hopefully if you have some of your strategies, you can share those on the comment section on this video, and we can partake in some conversation about how to make the cable organization side, the use of cables in your system, how to make that more meaningful to other musicians and sound designers out there. Okay, and one additional thing I wanted to mention with this video on cables is cable organization. So I have here a Pomona, these orange cable holders. Got another one on the wall. Let me just move the camera for you. It's actually for thicker cables, and that typically I use for my 1/8 inch to 1/4 cables. If you use this one on the wall here with standard Eurorack cables, they actually will fall through. And I think okay, we'll go back to the original one I was talking about here. So I will put a screenshot of this up so you can read it, but this is the card that comes with the Pomona electronics. They call this the test lead holder, and I'll be sure to make this clear so you can find them I bought them on Amazon. These get used for a variety of cables. Obviously, they're not necessarily just for Eurorack, but if you had any kind of test cables, scientific cables you used in your work or something, these could come very handy. So basically the orange ones, and again, once I put this up on the screen, you'll be able to take a look at the size, because that's pretty key in ordering these. The orange ones have the smallest width here. So this will be good for any cable where you're worried about it falling through. These are not going to fall through. Again, those black ones up on the wall I showed you have a larger space between each of the cable holders, and thus, potentially some of your cables could fall through. So I guess I would just say that I found these to be really useful. They run, I would say, anywhere between $10 or maybe $15 a piece, but I think they're very useful. In the past, I would actually take cables and try to put them in different Tupperware containers, and I just found it was like too chaotic. So what I've done here is I've organized them by length. So you have the small ones here getting bigger, a medium size. I have a few of my 1/4 to 1/8 thrown in, and then my 36 to 48 inches are at the end here. And then on the other cable holder, the black one up there, I've got all my tip-top stackable, because for me it makes sense to distinguish the stackable from the non-stackable in case I want to use those for a particular patch. So yeah, that will do it for this video. I hope you will get something out of this in terms of thinking about cables and their uses, and some of the considerations you might have in terms of purchasing cables for your Eurorack modular setup.